Now, O Lord, grant that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts might be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Politics have no relation to morals. So said the 16th century political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli. I have a confession to make. In recent weeks, I finally gave in to watching the Netflix show House of Cards. It is most surely a Machiavellian portrayal of the nature of politics in our nation. As one of your pastors, I do not recommend you watch it, but I confess I'm hooked. Despite the show's relentless descent into the darkness born of a lust for power, I can't stop watching it. Francis and Claire Underwood are the villain protagonists whose incomprehensibly calculating actions confound observers and devour their adversaries. The show tracks Underwood's ascent from Majority Whip in the House of Representatives, a representative from Gaffney, South Carolina, home of the giant peach, to vice president, and then eventually, after undermining moves that make the Civil War battle of the crater at Petersburg look naive, he becomes president of the United States. As alluring as it may be, House of Cards, well, it's got nothing on the Bible. Today's reading is a perfect example, filled with political intrigue and calculating moves, particularly around King Darius and his administration. It begins with a biblical description of how Darius set up his governance structure. He had 3 presidents, over 120 satraps stationed throughout his empire. One of those presidents was Daniel, the exile. We learn that Daniel distinguished himself so much from the other presidents and satraps that he won favor in Darius's eyes. And Darius planned on making him grand vizier, that is, president over presidents, president over all. Isn't that wonderful? Well, from the outside looking in, it certainly was, but from the inside looking out, we see jealousy bubbling among Daniel's other presidents and satraps, jockeying for positions of power in the empire. And that jealousy mixes with xenophobia in the form of anti-Semitism to become a crucible for a plot to destroy Daniel. All the satraps and presidents start digging to see what dirt they can find on Daniel to get him out of office. He is, after all, a foreigner. He's named as a Jew. There's got to be something on him. They look back into his past. What about when he interpreted the writing on the wall that would undo Belshazzar? Yeah, but that's what brought Darius to power, so nothing there can work. What about when he interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dreams? Anything there? Well, that king had some serious issues, and Daniel simply interpreted his dreams. He told it like it was. Nothing there. What about his college days? Maybe if we dig into his fraternity days back in Jerusalem, there's got to be something on this guy, something that we can use to get him out of the picture. Nope. Daniel was a straight shooter then. It seems he still is now. So, with no filth to dig up on Daniel, his conspirators decide to use his faith. They set him up, passing a law enforcing a national religion, no prayer except to the king. They begin by stating a lie. They come to Darius and they say to him, all the presidents of the kingdom and the satraps have agreed on a new law. That is not true. Daniel is a president, and he never agreed to this law. As their intent is to deceive Darius, it is a lie. It's not simply a misstatement or a falsehood. The truth is, not all the presidents of the kingdom agreed to this law, but Darius doesn't know this. And so the deceivers prey on his ignorance. The new law is that for 30 days, no one is to pray to anyone, divine or human, other than King Darius. Of course, this sounds good to Darius. What could possibly be wrong with such an ordinance? I'm the boss, after all. Did Darius wonder why a 30-day law was needed? Did he wonder, why are you coming to me with this request out of nowhere? Had there been some sort of mass revival, some sort of prayer fest seeking to undermine Darius's reign? Did anyone wonder why this legislation was necessary? You know, from time to time, people propose legislation that's not really needed. Did Darius think that it might have been politically motivated? Well, apparently not, because he signs the bill. He takes the bait, and we know what ensues. In response to the new ordinance, what does Daniel do? Well, he engages in an act of civil disobedience. Though he knows the ordinance, the text is clear in telling us that, he throws open the western windows of his upper room and proceeds to pray, praising God just as he did every day, 3 times a day. He knew what would befall him. He knew that those who did such things would be thrown into a lion's den, but he did it anyway. He joined a long line of the faithful who refused to abide by unjust laws, who engaged in civil disobedience because of their faithfulness to a higher law. Like Shiphrah and Puah, the Hebrew midwives in the book of Exodus, who would not cast the Hebrew baby boys into the Nile, ignoring Pharaoh's ethnic cleansing laws. Like Elijah, who challenged the prophets of Baal at Mount Carmel. Like Peter, who refused to obey the magistrate's command that he stop preaching the gospel. Like Stephen, who was martyred for the faith, for speaking truth to the power that was the Sanhedrin, and they stoned him to death in response. Like Rosa Parks, who refused to move to the back of the bus as the local laws decried, because she was a child of God, just like every other person. Like Joseph Charles Jones, a seminarian from Johnson C. Smith Seminary, who led 100 young people in sit-ins and 8 restaurants here in Charlotte in the 1960s, because all are welcome at God's table. Like Martin Luther King, who from a Birmingham jail wrote that people have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws, and segregation laws were unjust. Quote, because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. So, Daniel threw open the windows of his home and he prayed, just as he always did, knowing it would land him in the lion's den. And of course it did. Mighty Darius is revealed to be impotent in the face of his own decree. A decree established so easily through the manipulation of those who were supposed to work for him. Did Darius stand up to his administrators? Did he challenge their manipulation, their orchestration of this scandal to frame their overachieving counterpart, Daniel? No. Darius was a prisoner to his own system, a prisoner to his own pride, captive to the very system that created him. So though he knows what is the morally right thing to do, though he knows that Daniel was set up by an elaborate power play, though he knows that he is a part of something that might be legally defensible but is morally reprehensible, he casts Daniel into that den of lions. May your God deliver you, cries the mighty Darius, whose helplessness is exposed for all of us to see. He rolls the stone in front of the mouth of the den, presumably sealing Daniel's fate. Now, every Vacation Bible School graduate knows the rest of the story. Every painting I've seen on this story, even our stained glass window, is of Daniel in the lion's den. And yet, did you notice? Not a single verse in the entire 6th chapter of Daniel describes what happens in the lion's den. Instead, the Bible keeps its focus on who? Darius, on his anxiety, on his fasting, on his sleepless night, on his rising at the break of day and running to the tomb. I mean the lion's den. His anxious cry, "Oh, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God delivered you?" And then, for the first time in this whole sordid story, Daniel speaks. "O king, live forever. My God sent his angels and shut the lions' mouths because I am blameless and I have done nothing wrong." And Daniel was raised, and all was well. So ends the Vacation Bible School version of the story. But here today we read the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say. And what happens next, well, that makes House of Cards look like a children's fairy tale. All those who were engaged in the conspiracy against Daniel, along with all of their wives and all of their children, they are all thrown into the lion's den. And we heard what happened to them. Brutal. Brutal. So it is with worldly power. It is brutal. And its brutality is born of fear. And its fear is born of its fragility. How fragile worldly power really is. It is, in fact, a house of cards. In that house of cards, kings are easily manipulated by those who long to take their place. In that house of cards, laws are too often a means to the end of maintaining power, not administering justice. In that house of cards, innocent people are cast into lions' dens every single day. And more often than not, they do not come out alive. Witness the tragic story of Otto Warmbier, who died from blows inflicted by a brutal regime. Why? Because he tried to take a poster as a souvenir. In that house of cards, like King Darius, people in power, well, they lay awake many nights, unable to eat, unable to sleep, eaten up with angst, because of how fragile their world really is. Over against that fragile world defined by brutality born of fear stands Daniel. He refused to submit to the fearful threats that called him to compromise his faith. He kept living the life God called him to live. He kept praying, not hiding in fear, but throwing open the windows for all to see. And when he was thrown into the lion's den, he never said a mumbling word, as the old spiritual goes. And in the end, God delivered him. didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? Such is the nature of God's kingdom, where power is upheld not by lies, but by truth, not by fear, but by faith, not by brutality, but by love. Not all the Daniels of our world are delivered from their lion's den. Do you remember another Daniel? Daniel Pearl? Daniel Pearl was an American with Israeli citizenship. He was a journalist working for the Wall Street Journal when he was kidnapped in Karachi, Pakistan, by terrorists. 9 days later, he was brutally murdered. On the anniversary of his death, his father, Judea Pearl, an Orthodox Jew, wrote a poem in tribute to his Daniel. It's entitled The Lion's Den. It reads, "Come walk the road to Lion's Den, south of midnight, planet Earth, Karachi, Pakistan. Some called it nursery, some named it shed, a compound shack," the newspaper said. "I found it in my father's holy book, The Lion's Den," the caption read. "Come touch the walls on which two eyes with 1,000 dreams wrote songs, and fiercest battles, ancient wars, for 7 days went on. Never in the field of human conflict has there been a clash so total, so intense in charge and aim between two cosmic forces so compressed in space, so opposed in vision, so rooted in conviction, across so close a distance before so many eyes. Never stood a son of Abel so fiercely in the face of Cain, a giver to the teeth of claim, a curious to the blinds of self, a listener to the deafening shrieks of zeal, alone. Never beamed a ray of light so deeply at the core of darkness, music to estrangement, principles to whims, reason to the impulse, mankind to Attila the Hun. Never was this saga chanted in so powerful a rhyme. My name is Daniel Pearl, softly spoken from the lion's den, softly from Karachi, Pakistan. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, so the Bible tells us, no wound was found on him, because he stood his ground, because he stood our ground. So the Bible tells us. Daniel 6, verse 28. Beloved, it is tempting to give in to the despair that all there is in this world of ours is the house of cards. That it's all about power maintained through deception and brutality, fueled by fear, sleepless with anxiety. That's what Machiavelli believed. It's what House of Cards surely illustrates to us. But as people of faith, we must not give in to this despair. With every Daniel, we must stand our ground, not with a naive understanding of the world, nor with a pie in the sky, by and by, when I die kind of faith that ignores the injustices of this world and longs to escape to another realm, but rather with steadfast faith in the face of every lion. We must stand our ground to be a ray of light in the core of darkness, a people of principle in the midst of worldly whims, guided by thoughtful reason in the face of reckless impulse, generous in a world too often defined by greed. Because the ground upon which we stand, people of faith, is not shaky. It is the firm foundation of God's kingdom, a kingdom that is without end. The God who bends that long arc of the moral universe toward justice. The God whose throne is a cross, whose power is made perfect through a love that knows no bounds. As the old hymn puts it, on Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. All other ground, well, is a house of cards. So the Bible tells us. So Jesus shows us. So God encourages us, even in the midst of the lion's den. Thanks be to God. Amen.